From The School Days of an Indian Girl, Zitkala-Sa, Gertrude Simmons Bonine. Born on a Sioux reservation in South Dakota, Gertrude Simmons Bonine later went by the name of Zitkala-Sa, which means red bird. At the age of 12, she was sent to a Quaker missionary school in Indiana. Although Zitkala-Sa resented her educators and the lessons they taught, she went on to become a teacher, writer, musician, and advocate for Native American rights. The following autobiographical essays were published in 1900 in the prestigious national magazine, The Atlantic Monthly. 1. The Land of Red Apples. There were 8 in our party of bronzed children who were going east with the missionaries. Among us were 3 young braves, 2 tall girls, and we 3 little ones, Judawin, Thoawin, and I. We had been very impatient to start on our journey to the red apple country, which we were told lay a little beyond the great circular horizon of the western prairie. Under a sky of rosy apples, we dreamt of roaming as freely and happily as we had chased the cloud shadows on the Dakota plains. We had anticipated much pleasure from a ride on the iron horse, but the throngs of staring palefaces disturbed and troubled us. On the train, fair women with tottering babies on each arm stopped their haste and scrutinized the children of absent mothers. Large men with heavy bundles in their hands halted nearby and riveted their glassy blue eyes upon us. I sank deep into the corner of my seat, for I resented being watched. Directly in front of me, children who were no larger than I hung themselves upon the backs of their seats with their bold white faces toward me. Sometimes they took their forefingers out of their mouths and pointed at my moccasined feet. Their mothers, instead of reproving such rude curiosity, looked closely at me and attracted their children's further notice to my blanket. This embarrassed me and kept me constantly on the verge of tears. I sat perfectly still, with my eyes downcast, daring only now and then to shoot long glances around me. Chancing to turn to the window at my side, I was quite breathless upon seeing one familiar object. It was the telegraph pole, which strode by at short paces. Very near my mother's dwelling, along the edge of a road thickly bordered with wild sunflowers, some poles like these had been planted by white men. Often I had stopped on my way down the road to hold my ear against the pole and hear its low moaning. I used to wonder what the paleface had done to hurt it. Now I sat watching for each pole that glided by to be the last one. In this way I had forgotten my uncomfortable surroundings when I heard one of my comrades call out my name. I saw the missionary standing very near, tossing candies and gums into our midst. This amused us all, and we tried to see who could catch the most of the sweetmeats. The missionary's generous distribution of candies was impressed upon my memory by a disastrous result which followed. I had caught more than my share of candies and gums, and soon after our arrival at the school I had a chance to disgrace myself, which, I am ashamed to say, I did. Though we rode several days inside of the iron horse, I did not recall a single thing about our luncheons. It was night when we reached the school grounds. The lights from the window of the large buildings fell upon some of the icicled trees that stood beneath them. We were led toward an open door, where the brightness of the lights which flooded out over the heads of the excited palefaces who blocked the way. My body trembled more from fear than from the snow I trod upon. Entering the house, I stood close to the wall. The strong glaring light in the whitewashed room dazzled my eyes. The noisy hurrying of hard shoes upon a bare wooden floor increased the whirring in my ears. My only safety seemed to be in keeping next to the wall. As I was wondering in which direction to escape from all of this confusion, 2 warm hands grasped me firmly, and in the same moment I was tossed high in midair. A rosy-cheeked, pale-faced woman caught me in her arms. I was both frightened and insulted by such trifling. I stared into her eyes, wishing her to let me stand on my own feet, but she jumped me up and down with increasing enthusiasm. My mother had never made a plaything of her wee daughter. Remembering this, I began to cry aloud. They misunderstood the cause of my tears and placed me at a white table loaded with food. There our party were united again. As I did not hush my crying, one of the older ones whispered to me, "Wait until you are alone in the night." It was very little I could swallow besides my sobs that evening. "Oh, I want my mother and my brother Dawey. I want to go to my aunt," I pleaded, but the ears of the palefaces could not hear me. From the table we were taken along an upward incline of wooden boxes, which I learned afterward to call a stairway. At the top was a quiet hall, dimly lighted. Many narrow beds were in one straight line down the entire length of the wall. In them lay sleeping brown faces, which peeped just out of the coverings. I was tucked into bed with one of the tall girls, because she talked to me in my mother tongue and seemed to soothe me. I had arrived in the wonderful land of rosy skies, but I was not happy, as I had thought I should be. My long travel and the bewildering sights had exhausted me. I fell asleep, heaving deep, tired sobs. My tears were left to dry themselves in streaks, because neither my aunt nor my mother was near to wipe them away. 2. The cutting of my long hair. The first day in the land of apples was a bitter cold one, for the snow still covered the ground and the trees were bare. A large bell rang for breakfast, its loud metallic voice crashing through the belfry overhead and into our sensitive ears. The annoying clatter of shoes on bare floors gave us no peace. The constant clash of harsh noises, with an undercurrent of many voices murmuring an unknown tongue, made a bedlam within which I was securely tied, and although my spirit tore itself in struggling for its freedom, all was useless. A pale-faced woman with white hair came up after us. We were placed in a line of girls who were marching into the dining room. These were Indian girls, in stiff shoes and closely clinging dresses. The small girls wore sleeved aprons and shingled hair. As I walked noiselessly in my soft moccasins, I felt like sinking to the floor, for my blanket had been stripped from my shoulders. I looked hard at the Indian girls, who seemed not to care that they were even more immodestly dressed than I, in their tightly fitting clothes. While we marched in, the boys entered at an opposite door. I watched for the 3 young braves who came in our party. I spied them in the rear ranks, looking as uncomfortable as I felt. A small bell was tapped, and each of the pupils drew a chair from under the table. Supposing this act meant they were to be seated, I pulled out mine and at once slipped into it from one side. But when I turned my head, I saw that I was the only one seated, and all the rest at our table remained standing. Just as I began to rise, looking shyly around to see how chairs were to be used, a second bell was sounded. All were seated at last, and I had to crawl back into my chair again. I heard a man's voice at one end of the hall, and I looked around to see him, but all the others hung their heads over their plates. As I glanced at the long line of tables, I caught the eyes of a pale-faced woman upon me. Immediately I dropped my eyes, wondering why I was so keenly watched by the strange woman. The man ceased his mutterings, and then a third bell was tapped. Everyone picked up his knife and fork and began eating. I began crying instead, for by this time I was afraid to venture anything more. But this eating by formula was not the hardest trial in that first day. Late in the morning, my friend Judwin gave me a terrible warning. Judwin knew a few words of English, and she had overheard the pale-faced woman talk about cutting our long, heavy hair. Our mothers had taught us that only unskilled warriors who were captured had their hair shingled by the enemy. Among our people, short hair was worn by mourners, and shingled hair by cowards. We discussed our fate some moments, and when Judwin said, "We have to submit because they are strong," I rebelled. "No, I will not submit. I will struggle first," I answered. I watched my chance, and when no one noticed, I disappeared. I crept up the stairs as quietly as I could in my squeaking shoes. My moccasins had been exchanged for shoes. Along the hall I passed, without knowing whither I was going. Turning aside to an open door, I found a large room with 3 white beds in it. The windows were covered with dark green curtains, which made the room very dim. Thankful that no one was there, I directed my steps toward the corner farthest from the door. On my hands and knees I crawled under the bed and cuddled myself in the dark corner. From my hiding place I peered out, shuddering with fear whenever I heard footsteps nearby. Though in the hall loud voices were calling my name, and I knew that even Judawin was searching for me, I did not open my mouth to answer. Then the steps were quickened, and the voices became excited. The sounds came nearer and nearer. Women and girls entered the room. I held my breath and watched them open closet doors and peep behind large trunks. Someone threw up the curtains and the room was filled with sudden light. What caused them to stoop and look under the bed I do not know. I remember being dragged out, though I resisted by kicking and scratching wildly. In spite of myself, I was carried downstairs and tied fast in a chair. I cried aloud, shaking my head all the while, until I felt the cold blades of the scissors against my neck and heard them gnaw off one of my thick braids. Then I lost my spirit. Since the day I was taken from my mother, I had suffered extreme indignities. People had stared at me, and I had been tossed about in the air like a wooden puppet, and now my long hair was shingled like a coward's. In my anguish I moaned for my mother, but no one came to comfort me. Not a soul reasoned quietly with me, as my own mother used to do, for now I was only one of many little animals driven by a herder. 6. 4 Strange Summers. After my first 3 years of school, I roamed again in the Western country through 4 strange summers. During this time I seemed to hang in the heart of chaos, beyond the touch or voice of human aid. My brother, being almost 10 years my senior, did not quite understand my feelings. My mother had never gone inside of a schoolhouse, and so she was not capable of comforting her daughter who could read and write. Even nature seemed to have no place for me. I was neither a wee girl nor a tall one, neither a wild Indian nor a tame one. This deplorable situation was the effect of my brief course in the East, and the unsatisfactory tenth in a girl's years. I was under It was under these trying conditions that, one bright afternoon, as I sat restless and unhappy in my brother's cabin, I caught the sound of the spirited step of my brother's pony on the rock which passed by our dwelling. Soon I heard the wheels of a light buckboard, and Dolly's familiar "Ho!" to his pony. He alighted upon the bare ground in front of our house. Tying his pony to one of the projecting corner logs of the low-roofed cottage, he stepped upon the wooden doorstep. I met him there with a hurried greeting, and, as I passed by, he looked a quiet "What?" into my eyes. When he began talking with my mother, I slipped the rope from the pony's bridle. Seizing the reins and bracing my feet against the dashboard, I wheeled around, and in an instant the pony was ever ready to try his speed. Looking backward, I saw Dolly waving his hand to me. I turned with the curve in the road and disappeared. I followed the winding road, which crawled upward between the bases of little hillocks. Deep, water-worn ditches ran parallel on either side. A strong wind blew against my cheeks and fluttered my sleeves. The pony reached the top of the highest hill and began an even race on the level lands. There was nothing moving within that great circular horizon of the Dakota prairies save the tall grasses, over which the wind blew and rolled off in long, shadowy waves. Within this vast wigwam of blue and green I rode reckless and insignificant. It satisfied my small conscience to see the white foam fly from the pony's mouth. Suddenly, out of the earth, a coyote came forth, at a swinging trot, that was taking the cunning thief toward the hills and the village beyond. Upon the moment's impulse, I gave him a long chase and a wholesome fright. As I turned away to go back to the village, the wolf sank down upon his haunches for rest, for it was a hot summer day, and as I drove slowly homeward, I saw his sharp nose still pointed at me until I vanished below the margin of the hilltops. In a little while I came in sight of my mother's house. Dolly stood in the yard laughing at an old warrior who was pointing his forefinger and again waving his whole hand toward the hills. With his blanket drawn over one shoulder he talked and motioned excitedly. Dolly turned the old man by the shoulder and pointed me out. "Oh, Han!" "Oh, yes," the warrior muttered, and went his way. He had climbed the top of his favorite barren hill to survey the surrounding prairies when he spied my chase of the coyote. His keen eyes recognized the pony and driver. At once, uneasy for my safety, he had come running to my mother's cabin to give her warning. I did not appreciate his kindly interest, for there was an unrest gnawing at my heart. As soon as he went away, I asked Dolly about something else. "No, my baby sister, I cannot take you with me to the party tonight," he replied. Though I was not far from 15, and I felt that before long I should enjoy all the privileges of my tall cousin, Dolly persisted in calling me his baby sister. That moonlight night I cried in my mother's presence when I heard the jolly young people pass by our cottage. They were no more young braves in blankets and eagle plumes, nor Indian maids with prettily painted cheeks. They had gone 3 years to school in the East and had become civilized. The young men wore the white man's coat and trousers with bright neckties. The girls wore tight muslin dresses with ribbons at neck and waist. At these gatherings they talked English. I could not. I could speak English almost as well as my brother, but I was not properly dressed to be taken along. I had no hat, no ribbons, and no close-fitting gown. Since my return from school I had thrown away my shoes and wore again the soft moccasins. While Dolly was busily preparing to go I controlled my tears, but when I heard him bounding away on his pony I buried my face in my arms and cried hot tears. My mother was troubled by my unhappiness. Coming to my side, she offered me the only printed matter we had in our home. It was an Indian Bible, given her some years ago by a missionary. She tried to console me. "Here, my child, are the white man's papers. Read a little from them," she said most piously. I took it from her hand for her sake, but my enraged spirit felt more like burning the book, which afforded me no help, and was a perfect delusion to my mother. I did not read it, but laid it unopened on the floor, where I sat on my feet. The dim yellow light of the braided muslin burning in a small vessel of oil flickered and sizzled in the awful silent storm which followed my rejection of the Bible. Now my wrath against the fates consumed my tears before they reached my eyes. I sat stony, with a bowed head. My mother threw a shawl over her head and shoulders, and stepped out into the night. After an uncertain solitude, I was suddenly aroused by a loud, piercing cry in the night. It was my mother's voice, wailing among the barren hills which held the bones of buried warriors. She called aloud for her brother's spirits to support her in her helpless misery. My fingers grew icy cold as I realized that my unrestrained tears had betrayed my suffering to her, and she was grieving for me. Before she returned, though I knew she was on her way, for she had ceased her weeping, I extinguished the light and leaned my head on the window sill. Many schemes of running away from my surroundings hovered about in my mind. A few more moons of such turmoil drove me away to the Eastern school. I rode on the white man's iron steed, thinking it would bring me back to my mother in a few winters, when I should be grown tall, and there would be congenial friends awaiting me.